Everyone seems to agree this is a race. We vaccinate as fast as possible. It mutates as fast as possible. If we win, COVID-19 withers, falls back and lurks on the sidelines of human society. If it wins, then all of our futures are narrower, poorer, bleaker and in some cases shorter. The vaccine rollout is going well. But even the Prime Minister, a natural optimist, is talking about the new variant being more deadly and refusing to confirm we will be back to normal life by the summer. What we're learning right now, sorry folks, is that this race is not a sprint, it's one muddy marathon after another. To talk about vaccines and how we get out of this lockdown, I'm speaking to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. To find out what's happening in Scotland, I'm joined by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, in the latest of our leaders' interviews. From Labour, by Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. And I've been getting a glimpse of a possible near future from Yuli Edelstein, the Health Minister of the country furthest ahead in vaccinating its citizens, Israel. Casting an eye over today's headlines is BBC Scotland's new political editor, Glenn Campbell, and the Westminster correspondent of the Yorkshire Post, Jerry Scott. A lot to get through this morning, and so we begin with the news from Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. One of the government's top scientists has called on people to keep following all coronavirus restrictions, even if they have been vaccinated. England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Jonathan Van Tam, said it was possible that they could still pass the virus on, putting other people's lives at risk and prolonging lockdown measures. His warning comes as the number of patients on ventilators passed 4,000 for the first time in the pandemic. Search teams in China have rescued the first of a group of gold miners who've been trapped underground for 2 weeks. The workers were cut off after an explosion at the mine in Shandong province in the northeast of the country. Rescuers drilled small holes to supply food and medicine to the men. 11 miners initially survived the collapse, but one has since died. Boris Johnson has become the first European leader to speak to the new US President Joe Biden since he entered the White House. The Prime Minister held a telephone call with President Biden from his office in Number 10 last night. Speaking afterwards on social media, Mr Johnson said he looked forward to deepening the long-standing alliance between the two countries as they drove a green and substantial recovery from COVID-19. The Scottish National Party has revealed what it is calling a roadmap to a new referendum on independence. The strategy sets up the possibility of a showdown in the courts with the Westminster government. Boris Johnson has repeatedly said that he opposes another referendum, even if the SNP wins a majority in this year's Scottish parliamentary elections. 4 coronavirus vaccination centres in South Wales have been shut as the country braces itself for more snowy weather. Anyone due to get their jab at one of the sites today will have their appointment rescheduled. A yellow weather warning is in place for the whole of Wales, apart from Anglesey. Police are urging people to take care as snow and ice is expected to cause disruption on the roads. That's it from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 11:30. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks for that. And as ever, to the front pages full of joy, merriment and optimism. Not quite. There's the Sunday Express. Jonathan Van Tam, you're hearing there in the news, basically pleading with people to have patience. And on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, again, Van Tam, don't break the rules once you've had the vaccine. Government's very worried about that. The Mail on Sunday has a story about every teacher in Britain being vaccinated. That's one of their big campaigns. The Sunday Mirror has a grim front page there saying that this week we will hit 100,000 official fatalities from COVID-19. We're one of the worst in the world. The Observer has a story about a mass outbreak of COVID at DVLA in Wales. And finally, the Sunday Times is focusing. We have the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, on the show, and on cue they have a big polling-based story, Our Disunited Kingdom, looking at the sheer numbers of people in Scotland, Wales and indeed Northern Ireland who are thinking about leaving the UK. That is going to be one of the really big political stories of the year ahead. Now, I'm joined by our Scotland political editor, Glenn Campbell in Glasgow, and by the political correspondent of the Yorkshire Post, Jerry Scott, as well. Glenn, can I just start with you and this front page of the Sunday Times with a lot of words inside. This is not exactly news to those of us who've been following the Scottish story, is it?
No, but what this front page, our disunited kingdom, is looking at is what Professor John Curtis, the polling expert, says is a situation where the foundations of the UK are fragile, not just in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland, with the Sunday Times polling suggesting narrow majorities in both areas for there being referendums in the next 5 years on their future with the UK. And the polling also looks at the position in Scotland, where there's been a long run now, a trend in the polling suggesting majority support for independence. The panel-based survey for today's edition, surveying around 1,200 people, suggesting a majority of 52%. The polling also suggests that the SNP is on course to win an overall majority in the Scottish Parliament elections due in May. That's something that's very difficult to do in a Parliament with a partly proportional system of voting. And of course the SNP go into that election demanding another referendum on Scottish independence, and today setting out plans for how they would try to push for that if the UK government did not agree to hold such a referendum. They're talking about passing the legislation for a referendum through the Scottish Parliament, anticipating a court challenge and going to court to try and test the powers of the Scottish Parliament to hold such a vote.
And Glenn, if people are wondering why this is happening, there seem to be, from reading from the stories and looking at the polling and looking at common sense as well, two reasons for it. Boris Johnson is not popular in Scotland and Brexit is not popular in Scotland. Is that really what's rocket fueling the independence movement at the moment, do you think?
A lot of the analysis suggests that leaving the European Union, which was something Scottish voters rejected in the 2016 referendum, has been driving increasing support for independence. It's true that Boris Johnson is not popular in Scotland, and this polling reflects that. It also reflects that Nicola Sturgeon's handling of the pandemic is perceived to be very strong, whereas Boris Johnson's is perceived to be very weak. So I think all of those things are
very interesting. Yes. OK. Jerry Scott, it's taken some time for the government in London to really focus on this issue. It's been strangely slow to do so, but according to this, they are now doing so. Just talk us through what the government in London is doing to try and head off Scottish independence.
I think you're quite right. I think it's been ignored whilst they've been dealing with other things. I mean, it's the next big fight, isn't it? Forget Brexit. This is what's coming next. I mean, I guess the overall way they're dealing with it is saying, no, you can't have it. But there's been this cabinet committee that's been convened by Mike Gove to kind of discuss a campaign to build a new case for the union. And we've heard time and time again, you know, Boris Johnson is the minister for the union, and he's very proud of that. And they've got Oliver Lewis in, who in Westminster circles is known as Sonic, and he really led on the Brexit campaign. And they're even bringing in talks with former Prime Minister Gordon Brown as well, who's leading a constitutional review for Labour on the issue. So, you know, I think Westminster's really alive to this, but there's a 5-step programme that's been detailed today, and it kind of ranges from, you know, really fighting the Scottish elections hard, opposing a referendum and hoping that the SNP kind of fight between themselves, and then and only then really considering handing over more powers, but all on their terms, right? So they want to control any kind of timings of any votes. There's a focus on being more multicultural, the cabinet being more multicultural than, say, Germany or France, and looking to green issues and tech. And I think this is a massive issue, really, for Boris Johnson's government, because he would have to resign.
I'm sorry, Jay. Some of us struggle a little bit to see how devolution for Teesside or Coventry, and pointing to having Priti Patel in the cabinet, is going to turn the SNP tide, but there we are. One thing that's going to be a big issue, of course, in Scotland, Glenn, is what we would call a stúisí. between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. It goes back a long way, and it sounds quite complicated, but it is really, really important in terms of the unity going forward of the SNP itself.
Yeah, it might not be on the front pages today, but I think you'll hear a lot more about it over the next couple of weeks, perhaps. It's been suppressed by the focus on coronavirus, but there are inquiries looking into the Scottish Government's mishandling of harassment complaints against the former Scottish First Minister, Alex Salmond, and they are now nearing the end. For background, Alex Salmond faced accusations of harassment and successfully challenged the process under which he was investigated by the Scottish Government in court and was awarded more than £500,000 in legal costs. He then faced a criminal trial and was acquitted of all the sexual offence charges he faced. So what started with complaints about his behaviour has now morphed into something of a political, a parliamentary trial of his successor, Nicola Sturgeon. Was she candid about what she knew and when? Well, supporters of Alex Salmond say no, because she's trying to cover up a plot to bring him down. Supporters of Nicola Sturgeon say Alex Salmond is trying to spread false conspiracy theories to do damage to her, and that she'll give a full account of her position in the Holyrood inquiry when she appears before it in the next couple of weeks. Remember, though, we're talking here about the two figures who've dominated Scottish politics in recent years, led the country very close to independence. Their relationship has completely broken down and they're now pitted against one another. This makes, I don't know, Boris Johnson versus Theresa May or Gordon Brown versus Tony Blair look pretty tame by comparison.
Pretty tame. That's an extraordinary thought, Glenn. Thank you very much. Jerry, let me talk about the Jonathan Van Tam warnings in the papers. First of all, what is he really apparently worried about most?
Well, it's really that, once that people have had their coronavirus vaccine and, the rollout is going pretty well so far, that we can't just go back to life as normal straight away. And I think probably the image of fear in a lot of people's heads is like seeing people pack into pubs and restaurants again, because we don't know yet that the vaccine will stop the transmissibility.
And that's the real question, isn't it? Yes, that's absolutely suitable.
So arguably, you could still pass it on. Even if you don't get ill yourself, you could still pass it on to someone maybe more vulnerable than yourself when you have the vaccine. So it's that warning, really, making sure we're still aware of that.
Yes. And as we're all looking for ways to get out of this, of course, vaccine passports are talked about a lot. The government say, no, we're not doing that, certainly not yet. And yet the Telegraph here has a very interesting story saying that 8 vaccine passport schemes have won a total of £450,000 worth of government funding. So perhaps that is the next thing coming.
It's a lot of money to invest in something that you say isn't happening, isn't it? So let's see. This has been trialled in other countries, such as Cyprus. You've already got, holiday companies such as Saga and airlines such as Qantas saying that people will need to have this kind of thing if they want to fly. We will see this in other countries, I think. And, it's all based on really apps. So we know how that's gone with the Test and Trace app. So let's hope that they can get it to work.
Absolutely. Turning back to you, Glenn, the Mail on Sunday in Scotland has been looking at a story that's been quite strong in Scotland over the last few days and so forth, which is that the Scottish vaccine rollout has been a bit slower than England, but is no longer slower. At least the SNP say they're catching up. Just talk us through that.
There's the front page. At last, vaccine rollout 7 days a week. The paper is highlighting the fact that the largest vaccination centre in Scotland, the NHS Louisa Jordan, which is the Scottish equivalent of a Nightingale hospital, is now vaccinating 7 days a week. It's talking about that as being a big ramping up of the vaccine programme, but says it's behind England by a month in terms of the 7-day rollout. And I suppose it speaks to the wider concerns that have been expressed about the pace of vaccination in Scotland. If there have been 5.8 million doses administered across the UK, Scotland should be heading towards 500,000 at the moment. I think the latest figure was something like 380,000. So a little behind the pace set in other parts of the UK. But the Scottish Government would say that is because they've been focusing, first of all, on care homes and have done much more in that area.
Where the big problem was. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Jerry. Very interesting. And so to the weather. A fair number of wild and disruptive systems have been sweeping across the Atlantic recently. Dry January has proved anything but. What's next? Over to Chris Fawkes. Chris.
Snow, Andrew. Yes, we've seen a heavy band of snow push in over recent hours, coming down really heavily then in Ceredigion, covering the roads here. Further eastwards, Gloucestershire, similar kind of scene. And let's take a look at this band of snow that's pushing its way in across England and Wales at the moment. This is going to become quite slow moving. And I have to say, some of our motorways at times this morning have been completely snow covered. Parts of the M5, the M5 and the M4. Now, it's no comment on the amount of grit that's down, but for grit to be effective, you actually need traffic to mix into the falling snow. And we're only meant to be doing essential journeys at the moment. So traffic volumes are light, and that's allowing snow to settle on the A roads and the motorways as well for a time. So some tricky travelling conditions out and about. Snow in Northern Ireland as well, petering out later on this afternoon. Scotland and Northern England, largely dry with some sunshine. There will be some showers across northern and western areas falling as snow. So risk of transport disruption then for a time, particularly across Wales, Midlands, and across some parts of southern England as we go on through the rest of today. Overnight tonight, clear skies, widespread frost with icy patches to start the day on Monday. Monday, much more sunshine for England and Wales. But again, we're looking at some snow showers pushing into parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and probably a few for northwest England as well. That's the latest weather. Andrew.
Many thanks for that. Now then, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, joins me from Salford. Lisa Nandy, welcome. Thanks for coming in. Can I ask you, first of all, do you think that everybody who's had a first dose of the Pfizer vaccine should, as the BMA says, get a second dose within 6 weeks?
Well, the evidence is conflicting on this, and I have a lot of sympathy for the scientists. I think you're going to be talking to the Israeli health minister this morning, where conflicting evidence has emerged about the Pfizer vaccine. I have a lot of sympathy for those scientists who are trying to sort of keep up with what is an emerging picture. We've always said it has to be guided by the science. It would be helpful if the government could come forward and be level with the public about the basis on which that decision is made. But I guess the overwhelming message to the public would be, look, don't panic. The scientists are assessing the evidence. We have regular meetings with SAGE. If you get a call for the vaccine, come forward, have the vaccine. And I'm sure that there will be an assessment of that evidence, and hopefully the government will be much more transparent about the basis on which they're making those decisions in the next couple of days.
Well, I hear your expressions of sympathy, but this is a choice for politicians now. On the one side, you've got the 4 national medical directors and the regulator. On the other side, you've got the BMA. And in the end, therefore, it is like for politicians like yourself to come down on one side of the fence or another. Will you?
Well, I think that's right, but we don't have access to any of the data or the science that the government has. They haven't shared that with us, they haven't shared it with Parliament, and they haven't shared it with the country.
With respect, you know what the BMA has said, and you know what the medical directors have said. All of that is out in the open, and this is just one of those tough moments where politicians have to make a stand and make a choice. And the question is, can Labour and will Labour?
I've never been shy of making a stand or getting off the fence, Andrew. I've been someone who's prepared to do that all my life. But I just have to say to you that we've always said in the middle of a pandemic that this has got to be guided by evidence. There is a good reason why the Chief Medical Officer has decided that this is the right approach, because we're in a race against time to get the vaccine out across the country, and based on the evidence that he believes that getting a 12-week gap is the right gap. Now, if there's new evidence, and it appears there is, to suggest that 6 weeks might be better, then what we'll be asking for when we next meet SAGE, and what we'll be pushing the government on in the House of Commons this week, is can you make sure that you are level with the public about that, share that information with us, and that people can have confidence in the decisions that are being made. I'm very worried that if you end up with several politicians, particularly those of us who haven't had the benefit of seeing that science, writing our own strategy, what you could do is undermine public confidence. And we've got this amazing national effort to get the vaccine out at the moment. We've got to make sure that people keep coming forwards.
So that's in essence, you don't know, but you're explaining perfectly fairly why that is. Let's talk about the vaccine rollout then. Do you think we should close our borders to incoming flights from countries which don't have high vaccine coverage?
Well, I think the problem that's emerged is that although we've seen new strains of the virus identified in the UK, South Africa, Brazil and others. These are largely the countries where we have the capacity to actually map and track mutations of the virus. Scientists tell us that there are a number of countries where these strains are emerging that just simply do not have the capacity to map what is happening. So it's not just countries that have identified the strains of the virus that we ought to be careful about. Actually, what we're likely to be seeing, even if we haven't identified it, is strains emerging all over the world. So there is no question that we need to take border security far more seriously. We've been pushing the government to take tougher measures at the border since last spring. On Monday, we've got this delayed announcement, yet again delayed.
Right.
We would fully expect the government to bring in tougher quarantine measures. We would expect them to roll out a proper testing strategy, and we would expect them as well to start checking up on the people who are quarantining. Only 3 out of every 100 people who are asked to quarantine when they arrive into the UK actually faces any checks at all. That's just simply not sufficient.
You've described the new American President Joe Biden as a woke guy. What do you mean by woke guy?
I did think you might ask me that. I wondered if you might be a bit baffled by the description.
Yeah.
I mean, what I mean by that really is that Joe Biden is somebody who knows exactly who he is and what he stands for, and he's very comfortable with it. He's happy to stand up and fight for the working classes in America and to stand up for minority rights. He stands up against aggression from America's adversaries, and he looks out to the world and wants America to be an open, self-confident, tolerant country that plays a role on a world stage. You can call it woke, you can call it progressive, you can call it what you like, but the important thing is that under his leadership, America is self-confident, it's comfortable in its own skin, it's a reliable partner, it's the sort of leadership, frankly, that we're lacking here in the UK.
All of that is good. I'm just suggesting woke is a trendy word. It may not be a helpful one. Is it unwoke, for instance, to object to the vandalising of Churchill statues?
No, I don't think it is. It's a basic question of decency. I mean, you know, vandalising public property is a bad thing, but when you add into that Churchill is somebody who means a great deal to a lot of people in this country, who stood up and made the right judgment call at the moment that it mattered to protect this country and to defend our values and our interests, I think, no, I don't think that's woke at all.
Well,
it's about
really
common basic decency.
The reason I'm asking about it is that you attacked the Prime Minister for, quotes, trying to start a culture war over this very issue. And I'm just suggesting to you what he was actually doing is standing up for all the things you've just said are decent and right.
Well, no, I don't think the government's been doing that at all, because the whole country came together united in condemnation of the vandalism of the Churchill statue. There is overwhelming public support for that statue. The only person, as my colleague David Lammy said, who kept going on about it was the Prime Minister. And just this week, let me give you an example of this, because I think this has been a really sort of controversial issue, but the government cannot be allowed to get away with this. On Monday, the Communities Secretary wrote a piece in the Telegraph calling out the so-called woke warriors in councils who were renaming streets and pulling down statues. It then turned out that his examples were completely inaccurate. He had to apologise. This is in the middle of a global pandemic when councils are on the front line compensating for the government's failures. I mean, it just simply isn't
Let me ask you, let me move from Monday to today, where there's a report in one of the papers of you applauding warmly a Labour think tank report which suggests turning the armed services into, and I quote, human security services whose job is to damp down violence. And you were delighted by that. Does that represent your views?
No, it's complete and utter rubbish, and the journalist was told so. I mean, the difficulty is
that you applauded the report, and he's quoted the report.
Look, I didn't applaud the report. That is complete and utter nonsense, and he was told so before he wrote the story. I find this quite extraordinary, really, that the government has spent significant amounts of time since the Prime Minister got himself into a complete mess over whether Joe Biden was woke, trying to dig up scurrilous stories about me, most of which you won't see in the newspapers this weekend because they're not true. And I just think this sort of nonsense is ridiculous. We've always stood up for the armed forces. We've always stood up for this country. When I first got appointed as Shadow Foreign Secretary, I said that national security would be our top priority. I'd really just urge the government to get on with the task in hand, get a grip on this virus, start to rebuild our economy and stop dividing this country, start bringing us back together. These silly games are just not worthy of the government.
Lisa and Andy, we know the government is listening, or at least one member of the government is listening, because Matt Hancock is waiting to talk to me. But for now, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to us.
Thank you.
Now then, the government is rolling out the vaccine programme here faster than in any other European country, but ministers sound almost spooked by the new variant. Are they trying to scare us? I'm joined now by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Matt Hancock.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome. Now, we've got the UK now with the highest number of daily COVID deaths in the world, and in terms of proportion of the population, one of the highest in the world. After 3 weeks of lockdown, are you in control of the virus?
Well, good morning, Andrew. The good news is that there are early signs that certainly the rise in number of cases has been halted, and in many parts of the country that cases are starting to come down. This is obviously, it isn't just about the government, it's about each and every one of us, as we've discussed many times. And as you say, the vaccine rollout program is going really rapidly. We've now vaccinated, as of this morning, 3/4 of all the over 80-year-olds in the country and a similar number of care homes. And I'm just so proud of the NHS team who are delivering on that.
I've been talking to your opposite number in Israel, Mr. Edelstein, and he says that before restrictions can properly be lifted, they have to vaccinate 80% of their population. Is that the kind of figure that you're looking at here?
Well, it's far, far too early to say. And the reason it's too early to say is because we know with a high degree of confidence that the vaccine protects people from serious disease and, of course, from dying, which is obviously the whole purpose of it. But we don't yet know the impact on how much the vaccine impacts on how much you transmit the virus. So that's why it's so important that people continue to stay at home after they've had the vaccine. And Professor Jonathan Van Tam is out explaining that this morning. But that means that those sorts of calculations it's far too early to know.
Indeed, he is suggesting this morning that once you've had the vaccine, you can possibly still pass on the virus. And if that's so, a lot of people will say, well, when will we ever get out of these restrictions, if that's the case, if the virus is still passing on after the vaccination programme?
Well, we have a high degree of confidence the vaccine protects you from serious disease and, of course, from death. And we're monitoring that very, very carefully, both, of course, for clinical trials, but now we're able to monitor it in the field because we can see who is testing positive and connect that positive test result to whether or not they've had the vaccine, and critically when they had the vaccine, because we know that the vaccine takes around 3 weeks to be effective. So we are essentially monitoring the effectiveness of the vaccine, right across the country right now. And in fact, I talk regularly to my Israeli counterpart, and they're doing the same. And of course, they're the only major country in the world that's ahead of us in terms of the vaccine rollout. So this is critical to understand as much as we possibly can. But our goal here is to be able to start to lift the restrictions as soon as safely possible.
Yeah, but when is that going to be? I mean, as soon as means nothing. It could be 2028, for all I know.
Well, it's not going to be 2028, Andrew. And I've said before that we're going to have a great British summer. Well, we don't know the answer to that question. And, it's one of the many things that we don't yet know the answer to.
Well, let's talk about the different variants. On Friday, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, that the new variant is associated with a higher degree of mortality, and got lots of headlines for that. The following day, the Medical Director of Public Health England said, no, it's very early evidence and it's far too early to say. So which is it?
Both what the Prime Minister said is absolutely right, as is what the Medical Director of Public Health England said. And I think it's actually a responsibility of all of us to listen really carefully, because these are nuanced scientific facts. We know that there is a risk that the new variant is more deadly. Unfortunately, that is the result of the scientific analysis since it was discovered. We do not precisely know the degree to which that's the case. Right. And obviously, we're continuing to do more work on it. So you've got to be really careful in how this is described. What we do know with a high degree of confidence
is that it is
more transmissible.
OK, let me turn to, if I may, the even more worrying variant, the South African variant. In fact, there are two of them. Patrick Vallance says there are between 44 and 71 cases of the South African variant already in the UK. First of all, is that true? And secondly, if it is, are these people who have just arrived here from South Africa, or is this already spreading inside the UK?
there are 77 known cases of the South African variant here in the UK. They are under very close observation, and we have an enhanced contact tracing to do everything we possibly can to stop them from spreading. The majority of those have had contact with or come from South Africa, and that's why we've got such stringent border measures in place against movement from South Africa.
So, I mean, frankly, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that suggests that some people with the South African variant have caught it from people inside the UK, and that therefore it is already spreading inside the community of Britain.
There is not what we call community transmission, which is when you find a case but you can't find the link back to travel. At the moment, it is all linked to people to travel. And travel is, of course, restricted at the moment to returning Brits. You know, if you're not a British citizen or resident here, you cannot come here from if you've been to South Africa or Southern Africa recently. But it just shows how important these border measures are. And we've strengthened the measures at the border. We've taken, you know, the sort of stringent measures you would never normally take. And the Prime Minister has shown great personal leadership in this, in strengthening the measures at the border. And he, of course, you know, a week ago, we removed all the air corridors. And he, of course, himself has said that we don't rule out taking further measures.
Have you found cases of the Brazilian variant in Britain?
There are a very small number of cases of the variant that was first discovered in Brazil. On the latest count, there were 9, and we are again monitoring each and every one of those very closely.
And what about the second Brazilian variant? Any of that in Britain yet?
Not that we know of. No, we haven't. There are 2 Brazilian variants, confusingly. And of course, we say it's a Brazilian variant. It's a variant that was first discovered in Brazil.
Right. Yes. Okay.
And,
of course.
But nevertheless, the point in terms of protecting Britain is the same. We've got to be cautious at the borders. The argument has changed, you know, and the conversation around borders has changed because of 2 things: 1, the new variants, and 2, the success of the vaccine rollout program, which means that, you know, we cannot put all of this progress at risk.
So let's talk about the vaccines. We were told that we get 2 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine by about now, and that's been delayed for a fortnight or so to the middle of February. What's gone wrong?
Well, as I've said all along, this is a complicated manufacturing process. So, you know, we get it in as quickly as we can from the 2 manufacturers. They're doing an amazing job at manufacturing this as quickly as possible. And then the NHS across the whole of the UK is supplying it and getting it into people's arms as quickly as it comes in. We have done 2 million doses in the last week. In fact, in just the last 3 days, we've delivered more doses here in the UK than the entire programme in France over the whole period that we've been vaccinating. So, you know, the NHS, supported, of course, by local authorities, the armed services, is doing an amazing job. And we are on track to deliver the commitment to offer all those in groups 1 to 4, those who are the most vulnerable to this, a vaccination by or on the 15th of February.
Let me ask you about GPs, because quite a few GP practices are saying they are not getting enough supplies of the vaccine because it's being diverted into the great big new vaccination centres. Are you ensuring that GPs, who are, after all, really on the front line of this, are getting enough vaccine everywhere?
Well, of course, supply is the rate limiting factor. I don't know how many times I've told you that, Andrew, and said it in other places too. So supply is the rate limiting factor. The GPs are doing brilliantly. Frankly, I'd rather have a problem of all the teams on the front line in the NHS saying we can do more, we want more vaccine, because that demonstrates that as soon as we can get it into the country or get it manufactured here, we can then get it out through the NHS. You know, the NHS is delivering as fast as this stuff can be produced. And that's been our goal all along. Now, thankfully, because of the work we've done over the last year now, we have a better supply of this than almost any other country in the world. And that's why we've been able to deliver, you know, over 5 million, 3/4 of all over 80-year-olds. It's a magnificent feat by the NHS and the whole team.
Still on that question of supply, what should be, I imagine, a very easy question to answer. Can you give an absolute guarantee that everybody who has had the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine will get a second jab within 12 weeks? No ifs, no buts.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Now let's turn to schools, which is another big issue, and of course in the papers. Parents are wondering at the moment whether they can prepare to send their children back to school after the half-term holiday. Can they?
Well, we've been really clear that we want to get schools back, as fast as we safely can, but we've got to watch the data. And the Education Secretary has said that he will ensure that there's 2 weeks' notice of the schools going back, and so we keep this under review.
Well, the half-term holiday is halfway through February, so we're more or less at that point, which is why I'm asking you directly whether schools are going to go back after the half-term holiday.
Well, firstly, Andrew, it's too early to know, and we are not at that point. Okay. And hence, so it's really, the answer is really straightforward.
Obviously, parents are really concerned about this. What about by Easter? Will schools be definitely back by Easter?
Look, Andrew, throughout this crisis, we have looked at the data. We've made sure that we've taken action, as early as we can, but rapidly if we need to. And of course, I hope that schools go back out after Easter. Of course, I do. And the vaccination programme is going fast.
Okay.
But we've got to make sure that we get the cases down.
Of course.
And we've got to protect the country from new variants coming in from abroad.
Are you interested in the idea of vaccine passports? You're spending £450,000 on 8 different versions of vaccine passports. So again, I assume that one of the possible ways out of this might in the end be vaccine passports.
Well, there is a question of how, in the medium term, we allow for international travel as safely as possible. But I'm not attracted to the idea of vaccine passports here at home. We're not a papers-carrying country. But what I would say is that international travel right now should not be happening unless it's absolutely necessary. No parties in Paris or weekends in Dubai. That is not on, and in most cases, it's against the law. And so international travel should not be happening unless it is absolutely necessary. For instance, for a medical emergency, although frankly, with the NHS, we've got the best medical services you can possibly have in the world right here in Britain. So
no reason. Okay. All right.
So we shouldn't. So on international travel, we are being very cautious, and we don't rule out further measures. And as I say, the Prime Minister's leadership in this area. Can I just ask you very briefly,
what further measures are you looking at?
Well, we don't rule out further measures, but I'm not going to go into the details of that because we're working together across government to make sure we have the right rules in place to keep this country safe, especially from the new variants. Really,
Matt Hancock, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. We've run out of time, but thank you very much indeed. The message is quite clear. Stay at home and stay in Britain as well. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Now then, Yuli Edelstein is the Israeli Minister of Health, and Israel, as we've just heard, is way ahead of any other country in the number of its citizens so far vaccinated. It bought large stocks of the Pfizer jab in exchange for acting, in effect, as the world's guinea pig. When I spoke to him earlier, I began with the news this week that Israel's COVID coordinator claimed the Pfizer vaccine is less effective than we thought, when in fact that is not what the data shows. So what's the truth?
The truth of the matter is, Andrew, that we are just in the beginning of the campaign. We unfortunately do see cases that after getting the first dose, people get sick, get the coronavirus. At the same time, there are some encouraging signs of less severe diseases, less people hospitalized after the first dose. So at this stage, it's very difficult to say. It's not a clinical trial yet. It's just our empiric data. And we sincerely hope that we will have better information very soon.
We are trying to get a glimpse of our own near future because you have vaccinated so many more people. What are you seeing in terms of hospitalisations and indeed infections so far in the vaccine programme?
We still have a very small number of those whom we consider fully vaccinated, meaning a week after the second dose, according to Pfizer instructions. So we still can't boast accurate data on that. We are collecting every piece of information. We hope to be able very soon to say that the number of those hospitalized goes down. And one thing we are closely following, there's always been the situation that when you have a rise in people who are infected, you have an immediate rise in hospitalized and severe cases. We hope that this graphic, this slide will change a little bit, and then we'll be able to talk about the influence of the vaccine.
But from your point of view, it's essential, therefore, that people will get the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine on the schedule suggested by Pfizer.
As I've said, we had debates about it. I'll be very honest. We had debates about it in the ministry, and we decided to follow the instructions given by Pfizer. There were different opinions on that in Israel too, but as we have very little information at that stage, as you just showed to your viewers, the answers are still to come. So we decided to stick to the instructions we get from Pfizer.
In your view, how much of the population needs to be vaccinated before you can start releasing the restrictions and open up again?
We have nearly 28% of the population under the age of 16. So from the population left, we want to get to in very high numbers, probably to 80%. And then we'll be able to talk about something that reminds herd immunity. We do have to keep in mind that those who are recovering, those who recovered from COVID are not being vaccinated. We consider them at this stage at least immune. So probably the two figures combined, the high number of those vaccinated and those who already passed the COVID-19 disease will give us a different situation in Israel, and we'll have to still think how we deal with the school system, with the children who can't get the vaccine now.
That's really interesting. I'm trying to guess what our own future is going to look like. And you talked about a spike in cases. Is that any evidence at all that that is partly because of people who've had the vaccine relaxing too quickly, mingling too much? In other words, I've got the vaccine, I'm all right. Is there any evidence of that happening in Israel?
Well, I wouldn't call it evidence. Yes, there are cases like that. I do have to say that in every interview or at every opportunity, I'm trying to explain to people that they should be extremely careful after getting the first dose of the vaccine. I wouldn't say that it's like a change of the spirit in the country because of the vaccination. And people even accepted the fact that we have to go into a new lockdown. That was not easy, but, people see the numbers and totally understand. But having said all that, I understand what you're saying, and we were all the time trying to explain that vaccination is not a panacea. We are very glad about this campaign. We are proud of it. We hope that we see the light in the end of the tunnel, but it doesn't mean that the moment we get to, you name it, 50 or 60% of the population vaccinated, it will be the end of coronavirus. Corona is still with us, and we'll have to live with this reality for a long time.
Right. Now, the United Nations says it's your legal obligation to make sure the Palestinian people under occupation have a swift and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Why aren't you doing this?
As far as the vaccination is concerned, I think that it's Israeli obligation, first and foremost, to its citizens. They pay taxes for that, don't they? But having said that, I do remember that it's our interest, not our legal obligation, but it's our interest to make sure that their Palestinians get the vaccine, that they won't have the COVID-19 spreading.
I understand that, but the Palestinians have asked you for vaccines and you haven't given them some. And under the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention, Israel is required to do so. I can read it back. Article 56 says that Israel must adopt and supply the prophylactic and preventative measures necessary to combat the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics in cooperation with local authorities. Now, that means the vaccine. Why aren't you giving them the vaccine?
I would say that, first of all, we can also look into the so-called Oslo agreements, where it says loud and clear that Palestinians have to take care of their own health.
Again, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the United Nations says that international law should supersede the Oslo agreements on this.
If it is the responsibility of the Israeli health minister to take care of the Palestinians, what exactly is the responsibility of the Palestinian health minister to take care of the dolphins in the Mediterranean?
I'm so sorry. Let me put it to you that many of your own citizens also think you should be doing more. There was a petition by 200 rabbis which says Judaism teaches a moral imperative not to show indifference as our neighbour suffers, but rather to mobilise and offer help in times of need. The rabbis are right, aren't they?
The rabbis are always right, I guess, but I would definitely say that is exactly why when the Palestinians turned to us in terms of helping them with their medical teams, I authorized passing some vaccines to those medical teams who directly work with corona patients in the Palestinian Authority. And as you can hear from this interview, it's not because I think that we have a legal obligation. It's because I understand that they are doctors and nurses and they don't get the vaccine at this stage.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
The death rate in Scotland is now below England, but the vaccine rollout has been slower. Why? I'm joined now from Glasgow by the First Minister of Scotland and SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon, there will be lots of people at home in Scotland in their 80s watching this interview, still waiting for their vaccine appointments and reading that down south in England more than 50% of 80-year-olds have been vaccinated already. What would you say to them?
We took a deliberate decision in line with JCVI advice to focus initially on vaccinating older residents in care homes because that is going to have the most immediate and biggest impact on reducing the death toll. You've quizzed me rightly the last couple of times I've been on the programme about the death toll in our care homes. So I heard Matt Hancock on the programme earlier say that about 3/4 of care home residents in England have been vaccinated. In Scotland, that figure right now is 95% of care home residents. It takes longer, it's more resource intensive to do. We're well on track to meet the target we've set to complete all over 80s by the beginning of February. And of course, as of tomorrow, those in the over 70 category will start to get their appointments for vaccination as well. So we're all working to the same targets. I think we will see overall that we all are making good progress through this vaccination programme. But I think it is right, and I am very assured that it is right for us to have focused on protecting the most vulnerable to serious illness and death from this virus as early as possible in the programme.
Well, let's talk about the vaccine supply. So far as we can tell, Scotland has been allocated 700,000 doses for the time being, and 380,000 have been given to people. So what's happened to the rest of it? Genuine question, where are they? What's happened to them?
They're flowing from the allocation, and there's a difference between allocation and receipt into Scotland, to our health board and into our GPs. So we have already used about 400,000 doses, and the rest will be going into people's arms over the days to come. Now, of course, the UK government have asked us not to talk in detail about the supply. We had published lots of figures about supply that they asked us to remove from publication. But we are, just like the UK is, vaccinating as quickly as possible. We have a target in common with the other UK nations of having vaccinated by mid-February everybody in the top 4 clinical priority groups that the JCVI has set, and we are on track to do that. So there is no question. I saw the head of Scotland's GPs on Twitter just a day or so ago saying that firstly that Scotland's approach is the right one in his view, and that great progress has been made on supply and on vaccinators over previous days.
I'm sorry to jump in, but if we're talking about Dr. Andrew Buist, he also says the supply of the vaccine so far has been quite patchy, and there is a worry. I mean, we've been talking to GPs. There's a worry among Scottish GPs that there are too many levels of management compared with England, and it's taking too long to actually get to the GPs on the front line.
Well, I'd make a couple of points about that. The quote I've just used from Andrew Buist is actually, I think, more up to date than the quote you have just used. So I've also just seen you put to Matt Hancock many of the same concerns about patchy supply for GPs that have been raised in England as in Scotland. That is, I think, smoothing out and starting to be resolved. We have had the rate limitation of the number of packs coming into Scotland, which has limited supply to GPs. On this question of whether there is a more bureaucratic system in Scotland. I don't think that's the case, although we will always look to see what we can do to simplify that. Our health boards order the supplies and then allocate onto GPs. In England, that's done through clinical commissioning groups. The average population size of those is about 400,000, similar to the average population size of our health board. So I don't think that is the case, but we are not complacent about any aspect of this. We are taking very clear decisions about protecting those who are most vulnerable most quickly. And I come back to the point I started on, 95%, it's probably more than that now, of older care home residents in Scotland have been, no, don't cut me off here, have been vaccinated compared to 3/4 in England. So we're further ahead on care homes, the top group in the JCVI priority list.
You have said that already.
As a result of the resources on that, we are slightly further behind on the over 80s in the community, but rapidly catching up on that and on track, as I hope all nations in the UK are, to meet the targets we've set.
Let's talk about the Alex Salmond case. Your predecessor and former friend has said that your account of this is, and I quote, simply untrue, manifestly untrue, untenable. Parliament has been repeatedly misled. What did you think when you saw those words?
I don't accept that, and I will refute that vigorously. Look, questions have been raised about my handling of sexual harassment claims made about my predecessor. It's right that I am properly scrutinised on that. I had hoped that I would be before the committee conducting this inquiry on Tuesday this week. Unfortunately, that's been delayed by a couple of weeks. But I'll sit before that committee and I will refute all of those accusations, and I will set out my account of what happened, given the very difficult situation that I faced. And people can make their own judgments on that. But what I will never do is apologise for doing everything I could to make sure that claims, complaints about sexual harassment were investigated, that they weren't simply swept under the carpet because of the seniority and the powerful position of the person who was subject to them.
Your spokesman said that Mr. Salmond is, and I quote, spinning false conspiracy theories. Do you agree with your spokesman?
Well, what I do certainly sometimes reflect on is that at times I appear to be simultaneously accused of colluding with Mr. Salmond to somehow cover up accusations of sexual harassment on the one hand, and then on the other hand of being part of some dastardly conspiracy to bring him down. Neither of those things. Do you agree with your own spokesperson that he is spinning false conspiracy theories or not? There are false conspiracy theories being spun about this, and in that, coming from Alex Salmond. Well, look, by Alex Salmond, by people around him, you can draw your own conclusions around that. But what I would say is this: what is forgotten in all of that are the women who brought forward these complaints. Now, you know, at the time I became aware of all of this, just tried hard not to interfere with what was going on and not to do anything that would see these swept aside rather than properly investigated. Now, the Scottish Government made mistakes in the investigation of that, and that's part of the subject of the inquiry. But I didn't collude with Alex Salmond and I didn't conspire against him. But when I get the opportunity, which I've been waiting a long time on now, to sit in front of this committee, then I can set out these things fully. It's right, as First Minister, I was faced with a difficult decision. Then I have given me a free pass. It's right that I'm properly scrutinised on that. Then I have some good news, because we can follow this a little bit further, because at the centre of all of this is the question about what you knew and when you knew it about the allegations against Mr. Salmond. You said that you first found out when he told you at a meeting at your house on the 2nd of April 2018. But we now know that there was a meeting 4 days earlier in your parliamentary office where the issues were discussed. And you then said you'd forgotten about this meeting. Can you therefore now take the opportunity to explain to people quite clearly what you knew? When did you first know about the allegations? Just tell people. Alex Salmond told me about the allegations against him on the 2nd of April in my house. Look, I am going to go into this with the committee with the greatest of respect, Andrew. I'm not going to get into the weeds of this with you in a short interview. I've set out some of this in my written evidence to the committee, and I'm going to set that out in oral evidence to the committee when I get the opportunity. I'm very happy to do that, but let's not forget. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Alex, but I don't think this is the weeds. I think this is central to it. Let me try another question. Your husband, who's the chief executive of the SNP, gave evidence to the inquiry last month, and he was asked about text messages to other SNP officials which talk about pressurising the police over this case. And he said the language is inappropriate, but he'd done nothing and he wasn't involved in the conspiracy. But he also said that there were no other text messages of that
that nature. Is that true?
There are no messages that are relevant to this committee's inquiry. The text messages that you refer to there were, as I understand it, the day after Alex Salmond was charged with serious offences. The point he made was that everybody's emotions were running really high that day. You've just said to me something like he said he wasn't involved in the conspiracy. There was no conspiracy. Complaints came forward here. They had to be investigated. It's right that there's scrutiny into how those of us confronted with this handled that. But that's what the Committee of Inquiry is for. And I will sit in front of that Committee of Inquiry and I will answer these questions in the appropriate way and I'll show due respect to it.
OK, so those are some hard questions. Here's an easy one. If it is true, if it is proved to be true that you misled Parliament, you would resign, wouldn't you? You would have to resign.
I did not mislead Parliament, so I'm not going to speculate on what might happen in the future. I'm clear I did not mislead Parliament. But I think, to be perfectly frank, Andrew, I think I've got a right to due process of inquiries as well before you start to take me beyond those inquiries to what might happen then. I'm clear that I did not mislead Parliament, and that's what I will set out clearly when I get the opportunity, which I haven't had in front of the Committee of Inquiry yet.
Right, let's turn to drugs deaths in Scotland. They have doubled since 2014. You've been in charge all the time. When did you decide that this was a major problem for Scotland?
We've always known this is a major problem. We have a number of factors that lie behind the scale of drugs deaths, but I don't think my government has done enough and focused hard enough on that up until now. And I've been very open about that. I made a major statement in the Scottish Parliament this week setting out significant additional resources to tackle this, taking forward a number of the recommendations that are coming through our drugs deaths task force. This is something that we do need much greater focus on, greater resourcing behind, and I've appointed a new minister with dedicated responsibility of this, reporting directly to me, so that we start to turn around what I described this week as a national disgrace. And we have a national mission now to make sure that we do that. And it's been very warmly welcomed by many frontline campaigners on this issue.
I'm sure it has, but year after year after
right in terms of how we make sure that we intervene earlier with people who have drug addiction, offer them. So one of the things that we set out significant additional resources for this week was getting people into treatment much more quickly, offering same-day treatment, doing much more to prevent overdoses of drugs. So if you're wanting me to sit here and defend what I think is not defensible in terms of the level of drugs deaths, I'm not going to do that.
You can't defend it. That's fair enough.
Well, let me finish the point,
we're in the slightly strange position of me wanting to ask you about independence, because I had Boris Johnson on the show a little while ago, and you may have noticed he thought there should be a 40-year gap between the last independence referendum and any future one. What's your response?
Well, it's Robert Burns' birthday tomorrow, our annual Burns Day, and when I hear Boris Johnson talk about this, I kind of bring to mind a Burns poem, you know, Cowran timorous beastie, what a panic's in thy breastie. He's frightened of democracy. The polls now show that a majority of people in Scotland want independence. If the SNP win the Scottish election in a few months' time on a proposition of giving the people that choice, then what Democrat could rightly stand in the way of that? So Boris Johnson clearly just fears the verdict and the will of the Scottish people.
You say in a few months' time, therefore you're not going to delay these elections because of the coronavirus pandemic.
I see no reason why the election should be delayed, but rightly and properly in a democracy, it shouldn't simply be a decision for government. That would be a cross-party decision. We have legislation that had recently passed to put contingency arrangements in place. We might have to to do the election differently, more postal voting, for example, but I see no reason why it shouldn't go ahead at this stage. Many countries have had elections over the course of the pandemic.
Nicola Sturgeon, we're right out of time. One final question. If you do win well in those elections, will you have an advisory referendum, whatever Westminster says, a homemade Scottish referendum, yes or no?
I want to have a legal referendum. That's what I'm going to seek the authority of the Scottish people for in May. And if they give me that authority, that's what I intend to do. Have a legal referendum to give people in Scotland the right to choose. That's democracy. It's not about what I want or about what Boris Johnson wants. It's about what the people of Scotland want. And the increasing evidence is that they want independence.
Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much indeed. That is all from me. We're out of time, but until next week, goodbye.